Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, the first official Clemson Power Hour every Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We kind of figured, one, the boys love talking Clemson football. More importantly, the Clemson fans continue to show the boys a ton of love. Kind of got an episode dedicated to this Clemson team where we'll be doing kind of a variety of different things, right? Whether it's going back at last week's game, talking about what we saw, or for this episode, taking a look at one of the biggest games on this Clemson schedule, week one against Georgia. Want to get into a few keys for this Clemson program going up against this Georgia program. And Dill, you make no mistake about it. It is never hard it's always hard, I should say, to kind of try to find a weakness in this Georgia Bulldogs program. They're the number one team in the country for a reason, but the boys are going to give it their best shot. Now, before we get into it, as always, one to the Clemson fans, can't thank you guys enough for rocking with the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel every Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Clemson Power Hour. Deal. Without further ado, let's get into this one. And I want to start with something that it might be Clemson's biggest advantage in this football game, and that is you look at Georgia and what they have to replace on defense. They have to replace a lot of really important pieces in the back end. I think most notably Tyke Smith at that nickel spot. And then you look at Clemson on offense and say, where are their best playmakers in this passing attack? It's the wide receivers that are going to be lined up in the slot, work in the middle of the field. Can Clemson find those matchups they like week one against Georgia? That might be one of the best ways to move the football on a Georgia defense that we expect to be one of the best units in the country.
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about kind of getting that boundary attack going, and you certainly want to see part of that. I think that does open up a little bit extra space in the middle. But at the end of the day, you look where the real hammers for Clemson on the offensive side. To me, it's Brenningstool, it's Tyler Brown, and it's Antonio Williams. Those, to me, are the best three, the most proven three guys they have on this unit. And I think you said it best, and you probably left out that George also has to replace a really good safety in Javon Bullard. And Tyke Smith and Javon Bullard are two guys who have played and been in this Georgia kind of scheme for going on 2 years now. So they are going to be bringing in, whether it's a young guy or whether it's a Dan Jackson, who's a little bit older, but again, a guy who, if Brenningstool can get his way or get matched up on him in a one-on-one situation, you certainly like that matchup.
I think this football game, and like most football games, you kind of simplify the sport and say you got to find the matchups that favor you. And let's just be frank, it's really hard to find matchups against this Georgia defense that are going to favor a lot of offenses across the country. You look at the boundary, and I'm not saying Adam Randall or true freshman TJ Moore, Brian Wesco can't win some of those matchups on the boundary, but you do look at Georgia's boundary cornerbacks and say we do think they're going to be pretty damn good in the 2024 season, where we have question marks. And for the Georgia fans that are listening, we don't necessarily know what Jonel Aguero is, but he's not necessarily proven yet. And you have some of your best wide receivers, Antonio Williams, Tyler Brown, potentially working against Jonel Aguero. When you get that look, can you trust Antonio Williams or Tyler Brown to go win that matchup? And Dill, you made a really good point. You look at that safety spot, it's either going to be Dan Jackson, who is going to start for Georgia because he's a fifth-year senior, has been around this Georgia program forever, or it's going to be a true freshman five-star in KJ Bolden, where, again, these are good football players, but those are some matchups that you might be able to attack. Dill,
and I also think you can kind of probe at what they can or can't do, because you have really supreme route runners in Antonio Williams or Tyler Brown, and then you have a guy in Brenningstool who's really, really good catching the ball in traffic, being able to make contested catches. So, again, I think Clemson can probably try to figure out where Georgia might struggle and, again, kind of try to get after that matchup. And just because you're right, it's hard to find those like weaknesses in the Georgia Bulldog team. But, again, Clemson does have some guys I think are very underrated, especially in the middle of the field.
Yeah, I feel like people forget how big of a difference maker Antonio Williams is when he's healthy. It's very rare you get this opportunity, but I think maybe the biggest question mark we have about this Georgia defense probably aligns with what Clemson can kind of do really well, probably one of their proven strengths on this Clemson offense. Still, number two, and I think a really interesting storyline, and I would love to hear the Georgia fans in the comment section, their opinions on this as well. You go back to the film when Georgia played Alabama in the SEC championship game. that was by far the most probably timid performance I would describe Georgia's defense. You know what I mean? When Jalen Milroe burned Georgia with his legs a few times, or at least just had that threat of getting outside the pocket and creating with his athleticism, all of a sudden from Georgia, you saw them spy with two linebackers. You saw them really ask their edge rushers not to really pin their ears back and more just play passive and try to keep Jalen Milroe in the pocket. And I don't know if I'd say it backfired on Georgia, but you kind of saw Georgia's defense kind of take a little bit of a different attitude. I wonder if you can get Cade Klubnik involved with his legs. Again, he's not built like Jalen Milroe, but Cade Klubnik is a phenomenal athlete. People don't give him enough credit for what he can do in space as a ball carrier and as kind of a dynamic quarterback. If you can get Cade involved with his legs early and maybe get Georgia to kind of revert back to how they played Alabama in that SEC championship game, that's probably the version of the Georgia defense that you want to go up against if you're this Clemson offense.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you got to try to get those linebackers playing a step slower. You got to try to get the edge rushers playing a step slower. Even the defensive linemen, they need to be cognizant of, again, where the attack's kind of coming from. Because at the end of the day, I think you said it, and Clemson fans probably know this as well as anyone. When you have a situation where it's a DJU and they didn't really have an answer and DJU had no way to back that defense off, I mean, they really smothered them. And if you can't match the physicality, and it's really hard to just go mano a mano and match it with Georgia. But again, we've seen some good moments where athletic quarterbacks, whether that is Jalen Milroe and even Brady Cook, and he wasn't doing a ton of design running, but when he got his shots to attack them on the scramble, he was making it count. And again, I think you saw that Georgia defense, just like it wasn't stifling that Missouri team.
It wasn't, and again, I think you make a really good point. You go back to the Georgia defense we saw play Clemson in 2021. They weren't afraid of DJU's legs. They just pinned their ears back and got after DJ, and it was kind of wraps. Like Clemson just didn't really have a chance to move the ball. You saw the smothering version of Georgia's defense that we've seen so much the last couple of years. Can you try to back him off a little bit? And it kind of goes into what we talked about Cade all offseason and say you got to play into this kid's strengths. And one of his assets, one of his strengths is being an athlete, getting outside the pocket. I think it slows down the game for Cade a little bit too.
So well on the run too. That's another thing you almost wish you got to see a little bit more last year because it helps that Clemson offensive line that had, I'd say, up and down moments in terms of what they do in pass protection. But also I think it got Cade Klubnik a bit in a rhythm at times. I'd really like to see him be a little bit more, again, moving pockets, doing some of those things to kind of, again, just keep Georgia on their toes a little bit.
Number 3, flip into the defensive side of the football. And this is another one of those things where I think Clemson, from a personnel standpoint, has a really good chance of giving Georgia some problems, taking away to the middle of the field. I think you look at two different things. One, the kind of pass catchers that Carson Beck is going to want to go to, but more importantly, where he went to in 2023, right? It was Brock Bowers, it was Dominic Lovett, and it was Ladd McConkey. Carson Beck threw is such an overwhelming percent of his footballs over the middle of the field between the numbers. If you're Clemson, I think it's going to be the same story because you look at Dominic Lovett, probably going to be the go-to wide receiver. They're going to try to get tight end Oscar Delp involved, Benjamin Yurcek. If you're Clemson, you look at Barrett Carter, one of the more athletic linebackers we see in the country. We look at Wade Woodaz, again, one of the more athletic linebackers we see in the country, a former safety out of high school, a guy that is long, can get it done, dropping back in zone coverage or operating in man. And then you have nickelback Khalil Barnes. I think you have the personnel to try to take away the field for Carson Beck in this passing attack. And at the end of the day, if you can force Carson Beck to make some throws that maybe he's not as uncomfortable making, I think that could be an avenue for Clemson to give Georgia some problems on the defensive side of the football.
And I also think what you love is you have a really talented boundary cornerback room led by Avian Terrell, who's a guy, again, really I don't think is going to need a whole lot of help. And that's kind of something I think Georgia fans, if they're listening, they're looking for a little bit more out of Georgia. You bring in Colby Young, you bring in Humphreys from Vanderbilt. They want more explosiveness, more boundary threats. But at the end of the day, when you have an Avian Terrell on the field for Clemson, you can, again, put your safeties in the middle. They don't need to necessarily be cognizant of giving Avian Terrell a ton of help. So that, again, really making Carson Beck do things he's not totally comfortable with, or at least we haven't seen him be totally comfortable with. And that's kind of getting the ball to the boundaries and keeping it away from the middle.
And kind of piggybacking off what you just said about Avian Terrell, because I think that conversation has a lot to do with our fourth key as well. Get Georgia behind the chains. You go, and this is number 4. This is kind of a no-doubt one, but it matters. You go back to Georgia in 2023. They were the number 1 team in the country on third down. They completed 55% of their third down plays. Why was that? Because Georgia did an exceptional job staying on schedule. How often was Georgia behind the chains after first and second down? Not very much, right? They can run the football extremely well. Carson Beck almost never took sacks. Clemson's going to have to try to do this. And this kind of goes to, hey, when you're playing a team like Georgia, you're going to have to be aggressive. Like, you're going to have to make some plays and be a little bit uncomfortable yourselves trying to win that football game. And so how can you get Georgia behind the chains? That's kind of the question I'm looking at, whether it's bringing pressure, whether it's putting 7-8 man in the box and then going to Avian Terrell, say, hey, we're going to put you on an island because that's a matchup we like, and say we're going to put 7 guys in the box and force Clemson to maybe go to the boundary. And that's a matchup that you're probably just going to try to have to win. But if you can get Georgia in those third and long situations where they're not at, I wouldn't even say they're not comfortable, we just don't see them in third and long much, I think that could be another avenue too. And I would probably couple that conversation with, they do have the front 7 to be disruptive. This is a very good front 7 for Clemson.
And it's really good on the defensive line. And I don't even know that we know how good this unit's going to be, because you look, young guys, TJ Parker and Peter Woods are 2 of the more excitingly high potential guys.
They're only getting better.
And then you also have a guy in Barrett Carter who I think when they let him go to work and they be really aggressive with him, I think he's a guy who can be super disruptive, make a lot of negative plays. I almost don't think we got to see enough of it last year. I think, frankly, that's why he's coming back. I want to see him get back to some of that like sophomore film where he was so dynamic, getting behind the line, getting sacks, doing a lot of those things that, again, I mean, you get negative plays on anyone. That's huge. And especially for Georgia, it's not where they live. It's not what makes them tick on offense, is being able to hit those plays down the field. So if they can make that happen, that's monstrous.
So going to, how does Clemson get this done? I mean, these 4 keys to the game, it's not like you just walk in and do this, right? Like, beating a Georgia team is not hard. We've seen it happen once in the last 2 years. It doesn't happen very often. What players need to step up? What players need to have the games of their lives to kind of pull this upside down? I'm going to go first, and I'm going to go grab Antonio Williams. Again, we kind of talk about that one matchup that I think the biggest question about this football game is, hey, can Clemson move the football on Georgia's defense? Because Clemson's often struggled to move the football on a lot of defenses last year. This is one of the best defenses in the country. One of the keys to that is Antonio Williams getting back healthy, getting back to being a difference maker for this Clemson offense, where they just lacked difference makers last year. And on top of that, they're going to have a matchup that you might like against a very young nickel corner in Jonel Aguero. I feel like if Clemson wins this football game, Antonio Williams is going over 100 yards.
And he's a monster one, just because, again, like, he was a guy we were so excited for, even going back to last year, and just could not stay healthy. And he's a guy who it feels like Cade Klubnik can just make his life a lot easier, where last year it didn't feel like there was enough easiness, not enough separation generally. Antonio Williams is a guy who can make that happen.
All right, number 2, I'll put you on the spot here. Who you got?
I think it goes to Avian Terrell. I think Avian Terrell might be the most important player on this Clemson team, period. I think, again, when you have a really elite boundary corner and you look at the best defense in college football, you go to Michigan, you go to Ohio State, you go to Notre Dame, all 3 of those.
You even go to Georgia last year with Kamari Lassiter.
100% Georgia. They all have first-round talents at the cornerback spot who don't need a ton of help, and they really lean on those guys to make everyone else lives easier, especially with Clemson probably trying to break some younger guys in as well and dealing with some injuries on the other side of the boundary. I think Avian Terrell having a real shutdown game and just, okay, line up whoever you want against me. I'm taking it away. He needs to do that.
Last one I got. I got 2 more. Jake, I got 3 more. One is kind of cheating. Going to go Wade Woodaz. I think Wade Woodaz, whether he's making negative plays, whether he's dealing with the tight ends up the middle of the field, he's going to be massive. And again, I think
this tight end in the Georgia offense, it's huge.
Taking away a Georgia tight end is much harder said than done, right? Or I think much harder said than done. I think I said that right. That being said, Wade Woodaz, as a former safety, I think has that kind of ability And then Jake Bringenstool. I think Jake Bringenstool is going to be massive for this Clemson offense. Now, Bill, the X factor here, I'm going to go Garrett Riley. Hey, we brought Garrett Riley to Clemson to win these kind of football games. You don't beat Georgia without hitting some sort of game-changing play on the offensive side of the football. We just didn't see enough of that in the 2023 season. What kind of play can Garrett Riley find that can, kind of send that message that, hey, Clemson's got a chance to win this football game? I go back to how Alabama beat Georgia last year, kind of leaking that running back out in kind of that wheel route, picking the linebacker and hitting it for a touchdown. You got to find one of those plays that you can hit against this Georgia team, because let's be frank, it is going to be very hard to march the football down on Georgia when you're on offense. You got to be able to find an explosive play. Can Garrett Riley find that week one? Maybe the biggest question of this football game.
Yeah, I think that's a huge one, because even going back to last year, you saw the remnants, and there's where that element of Cade Klubnik, when it's there, it's got to be hit. And you go to that NC State game, I mean, that tight end kind of screen coming down the line of scrimmage, it's a big play or something Garrett Riley likes to go to. They have it in that NC State game. Klubnik misses it by a hair. Like, when it's there, Klubnik has to hit it. So him and Garrett Riley together need to, again, when they get their chance, they need to execute. And that was a huge problem for Clemson last year. So I think we're all kind of looking, when they have their opportunities, hit that play, hit that big play that's going to change it. Because when you're losing all those one-score games that Clemson's losing last year, that's kind of the difference, is like those couple plays in the game that whether it's him, Garrett Riley scheming it up, whether it's Cade Klubnik making it happen, that has to happen this year.
The boys are struggling down the stretch, coming up with the words. They're gonna be a really fun game. We're definitely hopping on right after talking about this game. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys again. Clemson Power Hour every 6 p.m. Eastern time. Would love for you guys to join the fellas. Appreciate you guys. And we'll talk to y'all later.